Welcome back to the channel. We're back on our commander deck profile with Sovereign, Okinec, Ahau, or Ahau. Sorry, I didn't sneeze, but thank you for asking. For 4 mana, you get a 3/4 with Ward 2, where whenever this creature attacked, for each creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. So, we're going to have plenty of ways to put +1/+1 counters onto our creatures, ways to double our creature's power and toughness, in order to get even more +1/+1 counters onto those creatures, and double that number that we're putting on them while we're at it, in order to make sure that we have as many powerful creatures as possible in order to trample over our opponents and deal quite a bit of damage to them in order to win the game. But that's the general overview of the deck. Let's get into it card by card. As always, we start Arcane. We're not starting with Arcane Signet, actually. We're starting with Lightning Grease. So we want to make sure that Sovereign Okinec can attack the turn he comes down, in order to make sure he could double everyone's number of +1/+1 counters the turn he comes out. Oslo the Shattered Spire. Since we're putting +1/+1 counters on the creatures, we may as well put that many +1s. You also put a +1/+1 counter on target artifact or creature you control to get it started. Yeah. Soul Ring for some additional mana. Swift of Boots. Once again, we want Ahau to swing the turn he comes down, so let's make sure we give him that haste. Earth Crystal, in order to double the number of +1/+1 counters that we're putting onto creatures. Super fun there. This way, we're putting a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the number of +1/+1 counters something has, except we're putting double the number of +1/+1 counters onto things. Okay, we're tripling the number of +1/+1 counters onto all our creatures. Great Henge, some additional mana, some additional draw power, some additional life gain, and also some additional +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Super good card in this deck. The Oslet, whenever a creature leaves the battlefield, put its +1/+1 counters onto this card, and then eventually move those counters onto another creature. This way you could then have an even more powerful creature to swing in with and double the number of +1/+1 counters on it that we just put onto it. Sun Falconer. We want to make sure that our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them can actually deal damage. So, and aren't just blocked by our opponent's token deck. So let's give them flying. Champion Lambholt helps us make those creatures unblockable, along with helping herself get even more powerful by getting more and more +1/+1 counters from her own ability, plus their commander's ability. Kalmavu, each creature you control gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on it, making them essentially into +2/+2 counters, which will then become essentially +4/+4 counters thanks to Sovereign's ability. Defiler Vigor, allowing us to get some additional +1/+1 counters onto our permanents anytime a permanent enters the battlefield. Make sure you have your dice handy, because they're going to need a lot of them for this deck. Also allows us some additional cost reduction, and this could become quite a powerful trampler. Dust Shell Crawler gives all of our creatures with those +1/+1 counters trample, also allowing us to start off the +1/+1 counters on our creatures while we're at it. Forgotten Ancient, super fun card in this deck, because whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and then you're just going to double the number of +1/+1 counters onto it while we're swinging with our commander. Gyre Sage, add green mana for each +1/+1 counter on this creature, allowing us to start off with its own ability with the Evolve, but also making sure we get a lot of mana when we double up its number of +1/+1 counter with our commander's ability. Incubation Druid, allowing us to tap for 3 mana anytime we get those +1/+1 counters onto it, which we have quite a few ways to do it with this deck, so may as well. Kami into Whispered Hopes, add X mana, where X is this creature's power. Once again, another way to be tapping for a lot of mana in order to get some pretty big plays when we have that ability, plus like some ways to double it, some ways to, have our commander swing in. Kodama the Westry, another way to give our creatures that trample to make sure they can actually deal that damage, and get us some lands while we're at it. We may as well. Kutsil Malmet Exemplar. Your opponent can't cast spells during our turn, allowing them to not fog, allowing us to actually deal that damage. Whenever one or more creatures you control with power greater than its base power deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. It's whenever one or more creatures, so you have to deal damage to multiple people in order to get multiple card draws off of that. But still, super good ability, because we're going to be getting more and more power onto our creatures. Mana Gorger Hydra, pretty big trampler, because it's whenever Sovereign Okinec Ahau attacks. For each creature you control, you double the number of +1/+1 counters onto it, so this is before the damage is dealt that you're getting that ability off. Machias the Lunarch, allowing you to get those +1/+1 counters onto all of your creatures, or some counters onto it, or, just doubling up its power and toughness with our commander's ability. Ouroborid, I think that's how you pronounce it. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is this creature's power. If we manage to make this strong enough, that's a lot of +1/+1 counters onto all of our creatures, which will be even more +1/+1 counters with our commander. Pride Malkin, once again, another way to make sure we're actually dealing the damage and not just being blocked by tokens. With that trample for all of our counters. Rishgar Pina Renegade for that additional mana for all of our creatures with those +1/+1 counters on them. And Warden of the Grove. Whenever another non-token creature you control enters, it endures X, where X is the number of counters on this creature, which is going to be quite a bit, because it's at the beginning of each of our end steps, we get an additional +1/+1 counter onto it, plus our commander's ability. Oof, that's going to be a lot of +1/+1 counters onto everything. For our enchantments, we have Beastmaster Ascension, giving all of our creatures +5/+5, which will then give 5 +1/+1 counters onto all of our creatures when we swing in with our commander. Branching Evolution, we may as well double up the number of +1/+1 counters we're putting on things. We're now at 4 times we have this and the Earth Crystal on the board. We like to see it. Remember how I said, get your dice ready? We have Kathar's Crusade in this deck in order to put +1/+1 counters onto each of our creatures anytime a creature we control enters. And with, how many creatures do we have total in this deck? We have, we only have 17. I know we have more. And with how many creatures we have in this deck, though, that is still quite a bit of +1/+1 counters we can be putting on things. Speaking of a lot of +1/+1 counters, we're now at 8 times the amount of +1/+1 counters we're putting on things with doubling season. Feldar Retreat helps us get those +1/+1 counters on things to start off with, along with some tokens to put those +1/+1 counters on. Garrus Uprising, once again, we want to make sure we have a way to actually deal the damage, so let's give them Trample. Hardened Scales, why stop at just 1 counter when we get 2 counters onto something? Hee hee hee. Innkeeper's Talent, another way to put some +1/+1 counters onto your creatures to get them started. And then give them ward and double the number of +1/+1 counters again, so now we're up to 16 times as many. Whew, that's a lot of +1/+1 counters. I've seen them. It's also not that hard to do. Mirai's Wake, in creatures control get +1/+1, allowing us to get that start with the power greater than its base power and toughness, allowing us to get an additional +1/+1 counter to start off, and then allow us to tap our mana for some additional additional mana. And then creatures we control have +1/+1 counters on them, have reach and trample, allow us to have an actual way to block flying, an additional way to deal some damage. Tarot Symbiosis, whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, draw that many cards. So if we have 16 counters being put on a creature, we're getting that 16 draw power out of our deck. Tribute to the World Tree, put 2 +1/+1 counters on creatures if they have power 3 or less when they enter. Just many, but the ones that it is, it definitely helps them out a whole bunch. And an additional draw power for our powerful creatures. Unnatural Growth, may as well get +1/+1 counters on our creatures equal to their power and toughness based upon what we have here. Let's scroll on over to the second half of the deck. We have Beast Within for some removal. Dawn's Truth. We don't want all of our stuff with the +1/+1 counters on them to get removed, so let's have some protection here for them. Eldamri's Call. Sorry, that's not a Final Fantasy card. I don't know how to pronounce it, which I also don't know how to pronounce. May as well get our best creature card out of our deck in order to put it onto the battlefield. Gaia's Gift for some protection. Generous Gift for some removal. Heroic Intervention for some protection. Hunter's Insight for a little bit of removal. Deals damage to a player or planeswalker this turn. Sorry, this is actually draw power. So you can have a different card. Inspiring Call in order to draw cards for all of our creatures with the +1/+1 counters on them. Path to Exile for some removal. Pledge of Unity, get them started with those +1/+1 counters on them in order to make sure that we actually have some +1/+1 counters put on them. Ram Drew, this was a common thing here. Target creature control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Creature control has trample, excess damage is dealt to creature's controller instead. So many of our things are going to have trambles, that's a lot of damage to our opponent. Return of the Wild Speaker, draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, aka most of our stuff. Or you also give our creatures +3/+3, so you get those +1/+1 counters on them. Silk Guard, or give all of our creatures hexproof until end of turn for that little bit of protection because they're all going to have those +1/+1 counters on them. Also, way to start putting those +1/+1 counters onto them. Snakeskin Veil, a little bit more protection and some more +1/+1 counters. Stroke of Midnight for some removal. Swords Plowshares for some removal. Tyvar Sand, even more protection. Same with Unbreakable Formation. And as always, we'll go to lands last. Cultivate for some mana, Damning Verdict, destroy all of our opponent's stuff without destroying any of our stuff. Fair. And then we have Requisition Raid in order to get those +1/+1 counters onto our creatures, along with being a little bit of removal there. And finally, we have Rishkar's Expertise in order to get plenty of draw power off of those super powerful creatures that we're going to have on the board, and then get potentially an Unnatural Growth, maybe a Champion Lambhold, something we need from our hand onto the battlefield there. But as always, we're just going to scroll through the lands here. Thank you guys so much for tuning into the channel. If you guys liked the deck, make sure you like the video. If you guys have any improvements you make to the deck, leave it down there in the comment section, along with what commanders you think we should cover next. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of the day.